So food, I realize, might seem like a strange way to get at history. And sometimes it can definitely be hard to see how any given cookbook says things or reveals things about the time and place where it was published. But looking at recipes, especially from an era as transformative as the Civil War era, I found can be revealing in all sorts of ways. I recently published 2 books about food in the Civil War era, one focusing on the North and one focusing on the South. Both books contain historical recipes, as well as essays that put those into context. And creating them was an absolutely fascinating experience, in part because the contrast between the 2 regions emerged so incredibly vividly through the recipes themselves. So in Northern cookbooks that were published during the war years, direct references to the Civil War were rare, even in those published right in the middle of it. Sometimes cookbooks included recipes with titles like Yankee pudding or Thanksgiving pudding, and those would have seemed to people at the time like clear references to contemporary events. Abraham Lincoln had just created Thanksgiving in 1864 because he thought a national, nostalgic holiday would be unifying and would raise morale. For the most part, though, Northern cookbook authors rarely made reference to the war that was raging outside the kitchen window. But the very absence of politics can also be revealing. It's a reminder that dinner still appeared on most Northern tables most nights, even if that table was missing a father or a son. It's also just a general reminder that life on the Northern home front didn't see that many devastating changes. In contrast, Southern recipes from the war years talk about the war at every step because the war was so destructive and so transformative, and many of those changes involved food directly. On the eve of the Civil War, few Southerners had imagined that their agricultural system would be anything but an asset. Thanks to the region's vast farmlands and mild weather and massive enslaved workforce, the antebellum South was one of the most productive agricultural regions in history. And what it produced, of course, was cotton. In the early 19th century, the cotton gin had made it easy and fast to comb out the seeds from cotton at the same time that mills in the north of the United States and in England were able to spin that cotton and weave it into cloth at lightning speed. Between 1800 and 1860, cotton exploded through the Deep South, creating an ever-growing market for enslaved workers to plant and harvest it. By 1860, cotton had made slavery seem indispensable to Southern culture and the Southern economy. Cotton made Southerners confident about their prospects in the war as they thought about it in 1861. Cotton was the fuel driving the Industrial Revolution, and mills in the northern US and in England were ravenous for it. Southerners felt sure that, if pressure from Northern industrialists to renew their regular cotton supply didn't pressure Abraham Lincoln into conceding to Southern demands, then European pressure would. Also, cotton had made the South, or at least an elite sliver of it, fabulously wealthy. And that wealth seemed like a major advantage in its own right. But Southerners had overestimated the power of cotton and underestimated the power of food. People today often assume that 19th century foodways were deeply local. And in fact, in a lot of the celebration of locavorism that you hear today, it often goes along with this vague historical reference. Back in our great-grandmother's day, everyone grew their own food. Food was always local. You always knew where it came from. And that's frankly false. It's quite, it's not even just an exaggeration. It's just really wrong on many levels. Before the war started in the South imported a significant portion of its food from outside the region, including much of their pork, their beef, their wheat, potatoes, cheese, butter. Southerners knew that the North hoped to exploit this weakness, but to most people it seemed laughable that the North might actually be able to force a region as large and productive as the South to go hungry. Many Southerners believed that even without imports, their region's farms could produce enough food to make them self-sufficient, at least for the duration of the war, especially because they expected it to be a short one. But the inadequacy of Southern food production quickly became obvious. The Union blockade of Southern ports reduced imports of food and other materials to a trickle, and the blockade only tightened as time went on. Already by early 1862, periodicals that were aimed at cotton planters were urging them to give up cotton and start growing food. But too many Southern farmers were yoked to the infrastructure of cotton production, or they were distracted or gone involved in the war. And even when some farmers were able to grow surplus food, they often couldn't ship it where they needed it to go. They had no way to send it to market. The South's system of roads and railways had always been meager compared to the North's, and the war made transportation much worse because the military commandeered horses and wagons and took over what rails existed. Their inability to grow enough food and their inability to send it where they needed it contributed directly to their defeat. And then there was the armies themselves. Both armies lived and traveled and fought overwhelmingly on Southern soil, which meant in practice that the South often had to feed both massive armies. On paper, both Confederate and Union soldiers were supposed to receive similar ample rations of about a pound of meat and 3/4 of a pound of bread per day, supplemented with other things like sugar and coffee, etc. But plans on paper were a far cry from reality. Union troops occasionally went hungry, but for Confederate soldiers, deprivation and want became absolutely routine. Southern soldiers started getting diminished rations just a few months into the war, and their rations shrank steadily as time went on. By 1864, the average Confederate ration had shrunk to a measly 8 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of pork a day, and often soldiers didn't even get that. Hunger was worse when Confederates were fighting or on the move, and soldiers sometimes reported marching for 2 days on little but a couple of crackers. Recipes published in Southern periodicals, and let me just pause to say that one of the great sources on food in the Civil War in the South were periodicals, because they're one of the only sources that actually kept publishing. There was only one Confederate cookbook actually published during the war. So a lot of what we have are recollections from later, talking about what people ate. But as far as recipes in the war, these periodicals, these kind of magazines that had been aimed at farmers or planters, are one of the best sources that we have. And these recipes were often aimed explicitly at men at war, who needed cooking advice more than anybody. For the most part, Confederate soldiers were left to cook for themselves, usually with little resembling pots or pans or eating utensils. Meat could easily be spit roasted. When Confederate soldiers managed to get meat, the default method of cooking it was to spear it on some sort of stick and hold it over a fire. Obviously, that was much harder for things like baking bread without an oven. Apparently, a widespread method that developed during the war was to wind ropes of dough around rifle barrels and to hold that over the fire, which apparently was pretty successful. Soldiers rarely used actual cookbooks because they wouldn't have had the ingredients or the tools called for. But wartime periodicals were different because their cooking tips took that into account. Periodicals offered ideas like a description of panola. That was a dish made by pounding and seasoning dried corn, or a recipe for a nourishing drink that could be made by stirring up cornmeal and vinegar with water, or a description of preserved potatoes that were light and durable because they had been dried. Expectations about soldiers' manly courage or masculine behavior could sometimes clash with these simultaneous expectations that soldiers be cooking or nursing the sick. But some men clearly took pride in the new skills that they were learning. Like one soldier who boasted in a letter to his wife, "I will be able to learn you something in the art of cooking by the time I get home." Hunger, more than anything else, defined the experience of Confederate soldiers, and finding food became the preoccupation of soldiers' daily lives. Soldiers supplemented their rations in a variety of ways by foraging for nuts and berries, by seizing enemy provisions after a victory, or very occasionally with a care package from home, although that was pretty rare. Most often, they got food by taking it from civilians. For Confederates, of course, that usually meant taking food from their own people, which made the stealing and grubbing morally complicated. But soldiers were desperate enough for food that they generally did forage and steal when they could. Of course, conditions were worse for prisoners. Southern soldiers sometimes encountered awful conditions in northern prisons, such as in New York's Elmira prison, which was nicknamed Helmira, where nearly a quarter of the inmates died. But in general, imprisoned northern soldiers fared much worse. Southern prison food was scanty and monotonous at best, and inedible or non-existent at worst. In many cases, prisoners ate anything they could get their hands on, setting traps for rats, snaring songbirds. Prisons like Andersonville in Georgia, or Libby Prison, this is a picture of Libby in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, became famous for overcrowding, filth, lack of food, lack of water, and astounding mortality rates. Northern civilians were outraged to hear of thousands of Union soldiers locked up to die slowly of hunger. Meanwhile, wartime food shortages changed home life too, as food conditions became dire for many Southern civilians. On the Southern home front, supplies got tighter and tighter as the war went on. While recipes published early in the war had blithely called for things like, a dozen Havana oranges, or butter or sugar, just a year or two into the war, recipes started focusing overwhelmingly on substitutes and substitutions. Pomegranate juice could stand in for imported lemons, one article informed readers. Potatoes could take the place of flour. Dried blackberry leaves could make an adequate tea. Whipped raw egg could pass as cream. Since the South had been importing much of its meat, much of its pork and its beef especially, from the Midwest before the war started, formerly commonplace meats became hard to find once the war started. Bacon had been a major pillar of slave diets and slave rations, so planters debated how little they could get away with feeding their enslaved workers while still expecting maximum productivity. In fact, cured meats like bacon, which needed both pork and salt, were especially hard to find because the entire South experienced a critical salt shortage. Before the war, Southerners had actually consumed more salt per capita than anyone in the world. From Europe, most of it came across the Atlantic from Welsh salt mines. Besides salting their food generously, Southerners had used salt, most crucially, as a preservative for meat and fish and butter. This obviously was in the era before refrigeration, and the South's warm weather made preservation especially important. As the Union blockade choked off imports, Southern salt reserves shrank immediately, and people scrambled to find a new supply. Of course, you might be thinking, the South is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean. People thought that too, and many in the beginning optimistically predicted they could just produce their own sea salt. That turned out to be almost impossible, because boiling down vats of ocean water took a mammoth supply of firewood. So that proved to be almost impractical on any sort of a large scale. In 1862, Southerners started mining a natural salt dome in Louisiana, but Union forces, who were fully aware of its value to the Confederacy as a preservative, seized it the next year. Southerners became desperate for salt. Some people sifted through the dirt floors of old smokehouses where decades worth of salt had dripped. Some people tried boiling old salt sacks. After salt, coffee was the import that Southerners missed the most, and recipes for imitation coffee appeared more commonly than anything else. And it was made with things in these imitation recipes, with things like wheat, rye, corn, okra, acorns, all of which must have been weak understudies for the real thing. But many Southerners described their willingness to eat substitutes in general, no matter how vile, as a sign of their patriotism. For example, in 1863, one woman wrote proudly that her 60-year-old mother was drinking wheat coffee without sugar, eating cornmeal instead of flour, and willing to do it the rest of her life, to use her own words, if we can only whip the Yankees. Southern hunger only got worse as time went on. By the final winter of the war, the unrelenting theme of food advice had become the search for basic supplies, as pleas for staple ingredients replaced recipes in the remaining Confederate periodicals. You can hear the desperation as one writer pleaded from Athens, Georgia, in January 1865. If our friends in the country ever expect to send anything here, particularly corn, cornmeal, syrup, potatoes, turnips, etc., now is the time to do it. Wartime recipes give a sense of how the war changed what Southerners ate. But if anything, they don't show fully enough how desperate the food situation became, precisely because the written sources were created overwhelmingly by the wealthiest Southerners who were least exposed to privations. So that even as commodities like salt or coffee dwindled, the wealthiest people on the home front usually had an adequate amount of total calories. Poorer Southerners suffered more, and sometimes they suffered terribly indeed. Huge numbers of Southerners went hungry at times, and small numbers of people actually starved. For example, one 1864 article reported that some were starving in the Georgia mountains, an already poor area made desperate by the departure of able-bodied men, raids by soldiers in both armies, and bad weather. With the crops failed and the livestock dead, one writer reported that the people were subsisting upon roots and weeds. In fact, across the South, hunger drove people to eat all sorts of things that had been considered inedible before the war, including rats, cats, dogs, mules, and insects. These are what anthropologists call pariah meats. That is, meat from animals that were socially inedible under normal circumstances. And you won't find any recipes for pariah meats in published sources, but that doesn't mean that people weren't eating them. We know that they were. Poor women, whose male family members left to fight for the Confederacy, often became so desperate for food that they demanded help from city or state governments. For instance, in the fall of 1863, an author in one planter periodical reported scornfully that a group of Georgia women, quote, claiming to be the wives of soldiers, wrote to the state governor demanding food and threatening to take it by force if their demands were not met. In fact, Southern women by the thousands did take to the streets to demand food or to seize it, especially after 1863, as circumstances for many poor families went from bad to unbearable. Thousands of poor women across the South rioted for food. And this idea of women taking to the streets in public protest was a radical departure from antebellum gender norms and really suggests how desperate these women must have been. Even when women didn't riot, their most common strategy was to write to their husbands or their fathers, brothers, at war and beg them to come home. And men by the thousands did just that. They deserted the Confederate Army. By the time the Confederate Army actually surrendered in April 1865, a full third of the army had already deserted. As conditions worsened across the South, women's inability to feed their families gnawed away at the Confederate war effort. But the Southerners who were by far the poorest and who suffered the most were the 4 million people, a third of the Southern population, who had been enslaved. The war took a devastating toll on Southern African Americans, with hunger, exposure, and displacement contributing to staggering rates of sickness and mortality. Money and race created gross differences in the way Southerners experienced the war, insulating some from want while exposing many others to the harshest deprivations. But no Southerners were unaffected by the war, and the experiences of the war, particularly the increasingly romanticized memories of those experiences, profoundly shaped Southern cuisine. Now, as I was doing this research, one thing that struck me again and again was how much the Southern cuisine that people think of today, when you think of Southern food or Southern cuisine, how much it resembled the cuisine I was seeing in these Southern cookbooks. Old cookbooks teem with the kind of recipes we expect to find when we go looking for Southern food. Grits and gumbo, succotash, hopping john, catfish, coleslaw, cornbread, watermelon pickles, chitterlings, sweet potato pie, many, many more. If you name a stereotypically Southern food, we can probably find it in one of these 19th century cookbooks. The more research I did, the more I realized that it's not a coincidence that Southern cuisine has a strong identity, or that that identity is roped to the Civil War era. And in fact, that's an important distinction, that I say to the Civil War era versus just to the Civil War. So let me explain. Looking closely at these recipes, it became obvious that many 19th century cooking techniques were really forms of preservation. Cooking was preservation. It had to equal preservation because being able to keep food from spoiling was one of the most urgent household tasks. Jams, vinegars, alcohols, pickled vegetables, pickled eggs, pickled meats, smoked meats, salted meats. These were all ways to extend the life of perishable foods. Before refrigeration, preserving food was crucial to survival. But what's interesting about the prevalence of preserved foods in cookbooks from the Civil War era is that many of the flavors that we associate with Southern cuisine today were not necessarily the flavors of the South at the time. They were really the flavors of preservation. From the bite of vinegary pickles, to the sticky sweetness of fruit syrups, to the pungency of pickles, to the burn of homemade liquors, to the saltiness of sausage. What's even more interesting is that back in the 19th century, the flavors on northern tables wouldn't have been much different. Preservation techniques were ubiquitous in kitchens across the country by necessity. Meanwhile, other cooking techniques that we associate with Southern cuisine today were not at all exclusively Southern either at the time. For example, when we think of a mess of limp collards or green beans boiled down to a heap with salt pork, we think of those as Southern flavors. But in the 19th century, people were boiling vegetables to death all over the country. And the main reason, one was taste. That was a sort of a part of the cuisine. It was a taste preference shared by people across the regions. But it was also had to do with medical beliefs at the time. It was widely believed that unless vegetables were very thoroughly cooked, they were indigestible and bad for health. So my main point is that many of the flavors that we associate with Southern cuisine today are really the flavors of the 19th century, not necessarily flavors that were unique to the South. A big reason is that people have been nostalgically celebrating the cuisine of the Old South ever since the end of the war. And as a result, Southern cuisine hung on to many of these 19th century cooking techniques and continued to value the tastes and the textures that resulted in a way that Northern cuisine did not. And you might be thinking, Northern cuisine? Because it hardly seems to exist, not in the same way anyway. If somehow the war had never happened, if there had never been an Old South versus a New South, Southern cuisine might not exist either. It certainly would have been very different because there would have been no reason to canonize the taste and techniques of this particular time period. As it was, nostalgia for antebellum eating began before the war was even over. Already by the early 1860s, some Southern women were at work on cookbooks memorializing pre-war cooking styles. And when those books were finally published in the late 1860s, they fondly recreated war recipes too, giving recipes for imitation coffee or imitation wheat, even when substitutes were no longer necessary. Other cookbooks soon appeared devoted exclusively to the cuisine of the Old South. One of the best and most accurate of these is the 1881 What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking. Unlike many of the racist cookbooks whose covers I just showed you, that would be published in later decades by white people claiming to recreate plantation cookery, this author, Abby Fisher, was a formerly enslaved woman and an experienced cook. Now this has become a very famous cookbook because it is the first cookbook ever published by a formerly enslaved African American. The author, Abby Fisher, was born in South Carolina in the early 1830s. She later lived in Alabama, apparently spending most of her adulthood as a cook on a plantation. After the end of the war, Fisher and her family left the South and headed west. And by the 1870s, she and her husband had established a successful pickle business in San Francisco. And there, her cooking gained the attention of people curious enough about antebellum cuisine to help her publish a formal cookbook. Abby Fisher would have needed help because, like the great majority of people who had grown to adulthood in slavery, she didn't know how to read or write. As I look at her cookbook, one of the things I always wonder about is how did it actually get created? Like in the most nuts and bolts, nitty-gritty way, how did it work? She called the people who helped her make the cookbook her lady friends and patrons, which implies a pretty unequal power relationship. Did she sit and recite recipes from memory while someone took notes? Did she actually cook the recipes she knew while someone sort of observed what she was doing? However they made it into print, her recipes' origins in speech rather than writing are sometimes obvious. They're sometimes repetitive. Sometimes they, sort of don't include as much information as you need, just as they might if someone were kind of describing on the fly how they made a recipe. And at a few points, her words don't seem to have been fully understood, such as in the recipe for circuit hash, which was probably her saying succotash, or in the recipe for jumberly, which was probably her saying jambalaya. In fact, Abby Fisher's illiteracy is a good reminder about why people write down recipes in the first place. It reflects a fear that cooking techniques might not survive unless they're recorded. After the war, that fear itself fueled the interest in pre-war plantation cookery, a style of cookery whose only expert practitioners had been kept legally and intentionally illiterate. With the dismantling of slavery and the departure of many women who had been enslaved cooks, the fragility of that body of culinary knowledge suddenly became obvious. Like other cooks who had been enslaved, Abby Fisher took her knowledge of cookery with her when she left the South. But her story is remarkable because unlike the great majority of antebellum Southern cooks, she eventually managed to transfer some of her knowledge into print. Now, a common racist trope in the Civil War era and for decades afterwards was that black women were great cooks, but not smart ones. According to racist thinking, African American mastery over cooking came from instinct. That instinct was the favorite word, rather than from science or study. As one white New Orleans doctor said very typically, every Negro is instinctively a cook. This illusion of instinct was bolstered by high rates of illiteracy. To elite whites, many of whom could probably barely have managed to boil an egg, even if they had a recipe, it might have seemed magical to witness a cook who could expertly produce hundreds of complicated dishes without written aids. But of course, the real source of such mastery was not instinct or magic, but years of training and experience, and an extraordinary memory sharpened by constant practice. Enthusiasm for Southern foods after the Civil War was deeply linked to nostalgia for faithful slaves. Especially between the 1880s and the 1840s, white Americans across the country built racist fantasies around the lavish plantation meals that enslaved African American women had supposedly cooked lovingly for white masters. These fantasies were immortalized in industrial food products, like Old South brand baked beans. These started appearing in the 1880s. or in commercial figures like Aunt Jemima, who was invented in the 1890s to market pancake mixes. By the early 20th century, nostalgia for the Old South was inextricable from nostalgia for the institution of slavery itself, and both were a regular part of American culture, rehearsed in popular songs and minstrel shows and dozens of cookbooks celebrating plantation cooking. For example, one of these cookbooks was the 1913 Dishes and Beverages of the Old South, which was written by a white woman whose family had owned slaves when she was a child. She claimed that, quote, our mammies, meaning the enslaved women who had cooked on southern plantations, not only knew their business but loved it. She nostalgically recalled her own mammy as a short, obese woman who served her white masters, quote, fondly and faithfully. But historical recipes from the actual Old South can also underline the falseness of this kind of nostalgia. For example, take the final recipe that appears in Abby Fisher's cookbook. It is pap for infant diet, meaning a food for newborns, a food for infants. In that recipe, Fisher noted that it was a plantation remedy, and she said, I have given birth to 11 children and raised them all and nursed them with this diet. Her words might sound simple enough, but in the context of 19th century slavery, they're extremely revealing. She highlighted that she raised all her children. That is, they all survived. In itself, that was a pretty remarkable feat in the 19th century, a time when almost a quarter of all children died before their 5th birthdays. But it was particularly noteworthy because Fisher had been enslaved for most of her childbearing years, and mortality was particularly high among enslaved children. A big reason for this high mortality was that enslaved mothers were usually forced to go back to work in the fields or kitchens long before their children would otherwise have been weaned, so that African American babies in large numbers were fed makeshift substitutes for breast milk. Long before the invention of safe baby formula, feeding a newborn anything but breast milk was dangerous, not only because of ignorance about babies' nutritional needs, but because milk and water in this era were vehicles for pathogens. Fisher's careful instructions to boil the milk each time would have reduced that risk for those lucky enough to have the time and equipment and fuel to boil a fresh batch of pap each time a baby wanted to eat. And of course, her comment that she raised all 11 of her children had extra significance for an enslaved person in the South, because it was remarkable not just that all her children survived, but that none of them were taken away from her and sold. And it's also no coincidence that while all the Southern sources I looked at that were written by white people included recipes with celebratory titles like Secession Biscuits or Rebel Wine, only Abby Fisher's book, the one source written by a formerly enslaved Southerner, didn't celebrate the Confederacy in any way. Ironically, even as these racist fantasies about faithful slaves would fuel Old South culinary myths, enslaved African Americans were in fact central to the development of Southern cuisine, just not in the ways imagined. The origin of the Southern cuisine that was canonized in the decades after the Civil War, they're complex, including a mix of European and Native American and African ingredients and cooking techniques. Southern cuisine is particularly tied to African cuisines because the slave trade diffused African crops around the world. Many enslaved Africans arrived in the South with valuable knowledge of farming, herding, and cooking techniques, skills that shaped what people in the South could grow and how they cooked it. West African foods like rice, okra, yams, and black-eyed peas became staples in Southern kitchens and dining rooms, as well as native North American ingredients like corn and peanuts and squash and tomatoes and beans. And all of these, of course, met up with European foods like dairy products and beef and wheat. As with all cuisines, the borders of Southern food get messy when you look closely, because ingredients and recipes moved around all the time. By the mid-19th century, recipes like gumbo were showing up all the time in Northern cooking. cookbooks. This is from a cookbook published in Massachusetts. Well, Southern cookbooks themselves contain all sorts of recipes that might be surprising. Yes, they contain sweet potato pie and succotash and jambalaya, but they also contain recipes like Yorkshire pudding and roast beef and gazpacho and fricassee. At the same time, Southerners not only shipped in much of their food, as we've talked about, but people who could afford to do so used a variety of ingredients imported from abroad as absolutely everyday staples, like coffee and salt and pepper and cinnamon and chocolate and tapioca and vanilla and European wines. This was just absolutely standard. Also, of course, like all cuisines, Southern cuisine changed over time, according to what ingredients were available, what cooking tools had been invented, and what people liked to eat. Often made little reference to the fact that they were Northerners. Southern cookbook authors wore their Southern identities on their sleeves. Southern place names appear all the time in recipes from the Civil War era, like Wilmington ice cream or Virginia chicken pudding. During and after the Civil War, authors named recipes things like Confederate cakes or rebel pudding when they were built around substitutes that had been necessary during the war. Other authors used recipe titles to honor people they admired, like Jackson Jumbles, a kind of cookie named after Stonewall Jackson, or Jeff Davis Pie, named after the President of the Confederacy. Another difference between Northern and Southern cookbooks in this time period was their authors' attitudes about cooking. In truth, almost everybody was a little ambivalent about it during the 19th century. This was not, a contemporary foodie sort of celebration. Because often, if you were cooking, what that meant is that you were poor or you were a servant or a slave. In the North, writers often alluded to the fact that while you're reading the cookbook, we know you're mainly just going to be directing a servant's work. And they talked about the housewife as a manager more than as a manual laborer. But most Northern cookbook writers also assumed that a lot of their readers would be doing some cooking. In contrast, Southern women who were wealthy enough to buy books before emancipation almost always would have had an enslaved woman to do the cooking for them. In other words, pre-war Southern cookbooks were targeted almost exclusively at women who didn't cook. But even though elite white women rarely got their hands in the biscuit dough, that didn't mean that they knew nothing about cooking. Some of them were adamant on this point. They said, precisely because we have slaves working for us, we have to know all about it. We have to train them in every particular. Still, most elite white women probably didn't know much. And the war changed that, at least in some homes. When African Americans fled households where they had been enslaved, they often left behind white women who had to prepare much of their family's food for the first time. The war gave some people more contact with food production than they had ever had before. But for elites, that contact was often temporary. The war did not demolish Southern hierarchies. Many wealthy white Southerners kept a tenacious hold on money and privilege through Reconstruction and beyond. So the wealthiest Southerners very often maintained that privilege of ignorance, the ignorance about cooking. But as time went on, cookbooks both North and South were increasingly aimed at women who needed hands-on advice. And cooking in the 19th century was so hard even in the best of conditions, and that's something I have to constantly remind myself of. Just the physical tasks involved in a simple task like boiling carrots, for example, required time and muscle and judgment. A cook working by herself would have had to pull up carrots from the garden, most likely, find, usually haul water to wash them in herself, scrape them with some sort of an implement, haul more water. She'd had to have chopped wood or hauled coal to get a fire going. And this was one of the simplest kitchen tasks imaginable, boiling vegetables. Executing multiple complicated recipes at one time required high levels of skill. And for those without experience, getting started must have felt overwhelming. And of course, in our age, which is saturated with data, it can also be hard to remember how difficult it was to get basic information about the simplest things, like cooking. For people who had moved far from their friends or their family, And 19th century Americans were very mobile. They often did just that, they moved. Having a cookbook that actually gave detailed information on these kitchen tasks would have been invaluable. One way that cookbooks changed in this era was that they started giving more detailed advice. And they started making fewer assumptions about what a reader might or might not know. But even the most detailed 19th century cookbooks can look incredibly vague to modern eyes. Recipes often included no quantities at all for the ingredients they called for, or even when they did include quantities, they were often impressionistic, like butter the size of a goose egg, or the weight of 6 eggs and sugar. And even when they included what seemed like standardized measurements, nothing was actually standardized in the mid-19th century. So a cookbook author might call for a heaping teaspoonful, or a salt spoonful, or a wine glass full, but everybody had different size wine glasses and spoons, so you were constantly having to guess. And some recipes included absolutely no instructions at all, just a vague list of ingredients. Here's one recipe for molasses custard. I'm going to read the entire recipe. 1 quart milk, 3 eggs well beaten, pinch salt, sweeten to your taste with molasses. And that's it. Once a cook had estimated how much of each ingredient she needed, how to put them together, actually cooking was another exercise in guesswork, because there was no reliable way to know how hot an oven was, or how to keep it at the right temperature. Cookbook authors tried to provide some guidance with phrases like a moderate oven, or a slow oven, or a quick but not too hot oven. But it all really came down to guesswork and experience. For people with no experience, it must have seemed impossible. Looking at the history of the Civil War through food was so interesting, because I saw firsthand how seemingly neutral recipes can reveal unexpected things about life beyond the dinner plate. Focusing on food instead of more conventional areas of military or political activity creates, I think, a unique portrait of daily life via the flavors and the textures and the techniques that grew out of a time of crisis. So thank you very much.